can you introduce yourself and tell us what your post is here and what you do at Camden Council?
Yeah. Hello, I'm Zohra Chiheb. I'm an architect by background. I'm working here at Camden Council as a senior development manager. So that means I am part of the team that builds new homes, schools, community centres, and other buildings and provision for the community.
This project is interested in collaborative and community-led housing in the country, and I know you have experience with that. Could you just tell us a little bit about that background or what you've worked in relation to community-led housing before as well as an architect?
Yeah, sure. So as an architect, I worked with several communities to help sort of co-design processes. So I worked with Russ, which is a community land trust in Lewisham in southeast London. And a good few years ago now, they're actually on site building homes, affordable homes. They're self-building an element of it, so that was really interesting, and that got me quite inspired. And then later I was working at Camden Council, helping them develop an approach to selling sites to community groups, and one we did sell, or we started the sale process of one site. It's Croydon's had a number of financial difficulties, so I think that's stalled somewhat since I left Croydon. At Camden Council, then I also led on a sale of a site to a community group, including the bidding process around that. Expecting groups to come forward with an expression of interest, which talked all about what types of homes they'd build and how they would deliver them, and then was part of the selection panel that chose a group. So NW3CLT were successful there, and they're going ahead with Camden Council's first community-led housing scheme.
So because you've been talking about community-led housing, using that terminology, which I know is a terminology that is used in the UK, and this project has the term collaborative housing because it's the European term. I wonder if you can say more about what that means for you, what that encompasses for you.
Yeah. So I think it's about intentional communities, people living together in a more intentional way. For me as an architect and developer, that's often around the design and creation, build of the homes, and then with the intention to live together more as a community in the long term. I think we've got several recognised types of collaborative housing that sit under that umbrella. So that would be community land trusts, which is a legal entity for owning land in common that we have in the UK. There's also co-housing, which I understand to be more of a communal shared spaces, so potentially living, dining facilities together or shared gardens, and more just separated sleeping accommodation. There's a number of things that sit under the umbrella, but those are sort of the key ones. And I think for councils, certainly in Camden, they decided that the legal nature of a community land trust was important to them, so that was the only type of community group that was able to apply for the Camden site.
That's interesting. Something like a cooperative, would it be considered a kind of recognisable legal entity?
I think they also would have been. I think for the councils, this kind of then starts to unpick a lot of the issues of doing this type of housing within a council situation, but the council's legal and financial constraints around what it does with its land are quite heavily governed by lots of different rules, and I work with finance colleagues and legal colleagues on this, and I think cooperative would have been potentially considered. I think in this instance it was thought that the community land trust was the most suitable legal entity to buy the leasehold of the land. There's all sorts of different, it kind of gets into the legal ownership of the land and enfranchisement rights and all things that are just on the edge of my understanding of legal land ownership issues, but yeah.
this work with the CLT is the kind of first official foray into community-led housing as such. You know. So there's a new experience together.
Absolutely. I was just going to say it's expensive, incredibly expensive to build homes at the moment. We work to build costs of about £3,000 per square metre in Camden, which is but we're building very high quality stock. We're building the largest passive house scheme in Europe as part of the council housing. But those kind of build costs don't match with the rental return that we get. So the rents, council rents, are fixed by central government. They go up in line with I'm going to say the wrong inflation rate here, but they go up by a set amount. Also run by central government, and we project that off into the future to work out what the value is, and it's not anywhere near comparable with the amount that we invest in these homes. We hope that it's definitely a saving over the longer term, particularly for people who move in terms of lower bills, which is important in terms of high energy prices at the moment. But we've got a big kind of gap between what it costs us to build stuff and what we're going to get back from it. So we need to meet that viability gap from somewhere. So we're always thinking about cross-subsidising, and so there's kind of structural things about the way that we develop new homes in the UK that it's quite difficult for collaborative housing to sit in with. So another thing about the temporal thing is so in Camden and I think across London we've got requirements around, so we do 50% affordable housing in Camden, and of that 30% has to be social rent. That means we take people from the social housing list, and as I was explaining earlier, it's 6,000 people on the Camden list, and they're all in order of hierarchy of need. But it'll be the top people when those homes are ready that then become available, are eligible to move into those homes, and they can choose or not to. But would we, and I'm not sure we necessarily would, if there's a new community-led scheme coming forward, and would they, how would you make sure that you got somebody who was interested in joining a community? Just because someone's at the top of the list of the social housing list, it doesn't mean they're necessarily interested in being part of the community, and the community might have worked really hard to establish their community and think about what types of homes they want, but then they get a kind of set of families who are not at all interested in that sort of way of life or that understanding of the intentional community, and I think that could be quite challenging. Often families on the waiting list can be also quite multiple needs and vulnerabilities and kind of I'd say that could be quite challenging, that then moving into an established community that have a particular vision for how they want to live. But then are you being exclusionary by saying actually we don't want the people from the top of the waiting list, and actually we'll choose our own affordable, and then that's sort of like, well, why do you get to do something different if you're an intentional community, whereas every other site that comes forward has to provide homes for these people? So it's a difficult conundrum.
Yeah, it is. Ethical conundrum.
Improving access, yeah. Okay, so when I was at Croydon, both at Croydon and at Camden, the way that these projects have come about is essentially through, I suppose, the political interest in it. So community groups have managed to kind of lobby their local councillors or members to the point where there's political interest in releasing land for community-led housing, as opposed to any other way that it might come forward in a more sort of strategic manner. And then in both cases it's been such a new thing that it's been really just considered as a bit of a pilot approach. How could this work? Councils are very wary of risk, financial or programmatic. Any element of risk is quite difficult for the council to deal with, because we're not really a nimble organisation. It takes us a long time to make decisions, and we've got very kind of stringent controls over what we do with our money and things. So this type of housing is always met with a bit of a sort of kind of some layer of suspicion. But then there's also big benefits and a lot of corporate policy and thinking now is more around genuine resident engagement. How do we properly listen to our communities, get them involved with what we're doing, try and break down the kind of the enormity of the councils, that sort of someone from the outside trying to sort of deal with the council as one big huge entity it's very difficult for people to actually do that well. And certainly in Croydon we found it a really successful way of starting to have little conversations with people on a very local level about all sorts of issues. So you'd go and do really decent engagement around potential sites or the potential type of homes that could come forward, and then meanwhile you'd be talking to people about issues they've been having about antisocial behaviour, or there's always parking someone wants to talk to you about, or bin collection, or other issues that the council can address, but they've been struggling to find somebody at the council or the right team at the council to actually address some of these things. So I think that was a really important part of the process at Croydon, and I think good learning. In terms of the types of teams that came forward, that was another sort of learning for us. We were trying to make it as an inclusive approach as possible and not set the bar too high for the standard of entry, but then at the same time we were intending to sell land at a very reduced to market rate, and therefore we've got kind of responsibility. We want to make sure that the partner would be able to actually deliver homes, wouldn't just sort of pop in a kind of light application, then spend 2 or 3 years talking to the council and not actually end up with any homes. And then we've sat on an empty site for a couple of years, spent a lot of time and officer resource on something that then doesn't go ahead. So there was some level of credibility that we expected, which then sets a certain sort of standard of kind of barrier to entry for certain groups. So the successful group at Croydon was a very kind of experienced and well organised, quite middle class, and predominantly white group that came from a very affluent area, and actually led by somebody who's very experienced in community-led housing or kind of collaborative housing in the UK more generally. So had a very strong organisation and knew what to say in the application process around risk, finances, legals, design, and had a wide network of people to draw on to produce the documents that we were requiring them to submit, which we weren't paying people to submit we weren't paying anyone for any of their time. Some of this stuff will have taken considerable amount of time and kind of skilled input to put together. And so that's a bit more of a barrier to entry as well for people who don't have a network of people who they could draw on for that. We shortlisted another group who we were really really interested in, but just didn't have, certainly weren't comparable to the group that were successful, but quite interesting for this project in terms of your research, because they were a group of migrant women living in temporary accommodation. They were already working in quite a cooperative manner around childcare and other kind of informal support for each other, collections from school, and even things about people who'd been there longer, sort of supporting others with skills or things, training, or and certainly network support as well. They managed to draw on some professional network support. I think they worked with one of the universities to do the architectural input, and they had some support on the financial modelling, and they pulled together a reasonable bid. And the intention was for Croydon to sort of see what else they could do with them, because they were such an incredibly inspiring group of women. And so then that, I don't know if you want me to talk now about temporary accommodation.
Yeah.
So I think temporary accommodation's quite a kind of, I'm not sure how unique it is, but it seems to be quite a conundrum for local authorities in the UK. So local authorities have a statutory duty to house homeless people. So people who present themselves to the borough as homeless, we have a duty to house them. We have an acute shortage of housing to put them into, to social rent accommodation. In Camden, we previously had over 20,000 people on our housing waiting list. We now have about 6,000, and that's because there's been big changes to the way that people can qualify for homes. We had some people on for so long that they just never had any chance of actually getting into any homes, and so we made it clearer that, you know, certain people wouldn't really ever reach the top of that. So, but while people are waiting, they might be in other accommodation, or they might be in what we call temporary accommodation. So temporary accommodation is not, we don't consider it of the standard of longer term accommodation, and quite often it can be actually not in the borough. In Croydon, we had a number of properties that were quite difficult for families to live in, often converted office blocks with no outside space and quite small accommodation for the size of for the number of people who would be in it. Not really any facilities for the children in terms of play, and so Heads Together, this cooperative who applied and were unsuccessful, were a group of women who were living in temporary accommodation in Croydon. So I think their real desire, you know, yes, they were passionate about housing and collaborative housing. I think they were more passionate about housing, just having somewhere to live that was an appropriate space for them to be with their family. And they would have probably continued to work collaboratively on their you know, shared care and things. They didn't necessarily have a burning desire to design their own homes. It was more about, is this a way to actually get a home? Because people can be in temporary accommodation, you know, temporary is fairly misleading. I think that people can be there for years. We have another thing with temporary accommodation in Camden. I'm not sure how far this was an issue in Croydon, but certainly in Camden, much of our accommodation tends to be out of borough, and that can be even not in London, because we have such high land values, high rents here. It can be more cost effective for central London boroughs to provide temporary accommodation for people elsewhere. Yeah, and that can be particularly acute for recent arrivals in the country, or I think people who've been here for less than 2 years. The way the council decides where they'll be accommodated is it's different for people who've been here for less time, and that means that so migrants or refugees don't necessarily have the right that somebody who's been here longer to stay locally, and you know, because they might not have got those school connections or workplaces that they need to justify that they remain close to. It's
competition amongst needs.
Absolutely.
Hierarchy of needs.
A hierarchy of needs, yeah.
One another,
Yeah, and I think it's just the volume of people in need relative to the housing stock is just not comparable. I think it's still, I mean, those property guardian, the tenants' rights are incredibly precarious. So I think they have They have a license to occupy. You only get a week's notice. You've got to be gone. The rent isn't fixed. Also, there's not the same rules around habitation quality, so they can be living in places that aren't really, I mean, not legally unfit to inhabit, but you know, certainly not necessarily where you would want to, you know, bring up your family. I think that's really encouraging that they're managing to negotiate some additional things. So I suppose more broadly, the council would call that sort of stuff social value. So we do try and think about the additional social value that more unusual arrangements can bring. I'd say it's quite a new field. I'm doing something similar, but in a commercial premises with a commercial temporary occupier, and trying to sort of negotiate with them around lower rents, but in exchange for, you know, employing local people and training and skills and going into local schools and things. So that's going well here, but that's quite new and innovative, and that's in a commercial situation. So I think it's quite a new field, and property and legal and all those kind of fields are quite old school. There's a lot of different laws and things to get your head around. But it's great that the migrants are working together as a group, because I also think that network is really important, and one of the kind of key things that the migrants lack when they first arrive is that sort of understanding of how you get things done, even if it's, because there's no flow chart anywhere that says this is how you access this type of housing, or, you know, and
maybe to draw out a little bit this question of challenges, I think you touched on a really key one from a kind of council perspective that has to do with the many departments that have to incide on any particular project or initiative, right? So you have legal, financial, and that's at the council level. Then you have, of course, national level funding for things like community-led, which I know has just been cut as well. So you have these various layers of things that can be institutionally, you know, quite difficult and challenging. So I guess, are there, you know, in your experience, because you've worked also with groups, and you know that development process of groups per se as well, what you understand to be some of the broader or specific challenges for developing, you know, community-led housing, I guess broadly speaking, but then thinking specifically about questions of accessibility, right? So you mentioned temporary accommodation. So we were discussing how could we think perhaps about the temporality question, right? On the one hand, migrants and their trajectory, or refugees and their trajectory, and on the other hand, community-led housing, which has its own very long process and time, and you know that's one issue. So I bring temporality, but there might be other social questions. I don't know, things that you have experienced or that you think are challenges.
Well, so to touch on temporality first, I suppose it's some development takes a very long time, and it's not always certain that things will definitely come to fruition. There's a lot of risk in development, so many sites don't, go to a certain level of detail of design or even start constructing, and then they don't end up being as they were originally imagined. Meanwhile, communities can form, but then groups can have their natural, somebody moves away, they were the kind of main heart and soul of the group, or the kind of interests of the groups change, or people get disheartened, that kind of volunteer fatigue. They've been doing something for 3-4 years, but then there's not actually anything at the end of it, or there is something but not necessarily a home. So the challenges of that, then that matched up against the kind of rights of access to housing that migrants have in terms of, well, first of all, rights to reside in the UK, rights to access social housing, where the temporary accommodation is available. So there's quite a kind of, the timings of things would be, I think, quite a challenge to match up in this, but in terms of that's thinking about a new home building, whereas I don't think this necessarily has to cover, I think adding development of new homes into the mix in this is adding an extra layer of risk and delay and challenge that isn't necessarily what this is about. I'm not sure that these particular communities are that driven by I want to create something myself and design it myself, where some community groups in existence in the UK, that's really, they've always wanted to design their own home, and that's why they're interested in this. For migrants, or my understanding of this sort of sector is more about decent quality housing and living in more of a collaborative manner. So design, so maybe existing stock or kind of purpose-built accommodation might be a more appropriate place for that to happen. Some of the other difficulties, you've probably, there's the technical difficulty, land is extremely constrained in London. It's very difficult to find sites for new homes. When you do, they can be kind of challenging in terms of, do the neighbours want you to build anywhere near it? Are you going to get planning permission? Is there all sorts of technical constraints, like big underground sewer or something? So it's quite challenging and expensive to identify sites.
you've described to some extent some of the kind of collaborations that have happened in the examples that you've worked in here in Camden and in Croydon. Do you feel that there's a kind of partnership approach that benefits the development of community-led schemes that are potentially genuinely affordable, where migrants might stand a chance? Is there a kind of partnership model that you've seen, perhaps by experience, but maybe in other places you've visited or seen or know about, that could be helpful?
You mean partnership with the council, or partnership between people,
between different kinds of stakeholders that really kind of help to move this forward in ways that do promote kind of accessibility, so not just kind of a set of the middle class individuals that just want to design,
have a lot of energy and a lot of education
and resources.
I think partially because it's quite new in the UK still, and partly because of the way the systems are set up in the way that I've described, it would be incredibly difficult for some of these things to go without the support of a landowning entity such as the council, and sympathetic funding entities as well. I mean, delivery of all kind of genuinely affordable housing relies to some extent on grant, or certainly for the council to deliver it. So I think partnership with organisations that are not purely focused on profit, or if they, is quite an important one. Where I've seen it more successful in other countries is, Berlin, they have a kind of whole profession that's about facilitating partnerships effectively and helping the state work with community groups. I think that's probably a really important part of the puzzle that's not sorted here yet, really. There's nascent organisations that are looking at it, but it's difficult enough for me as a professional with over 10 years of experience developing homes to build homes, and it's literally my job here. So I can only imagine how difficult it is for people who are lay people anyway. And then even if those lay people are then, very well connected, well educated, well organised people who have lots of time, that's also another level of difficulty. And then, for migrants just arriving, I think you need to have the systems in place. Otherwise, it's basically the chances of anything happening are it's not going to happen, basically. Yeah.
Is there anything else that I've missed that you wanted to say or mention that you can think about?
I suppose maybe just to end on a more positive note, I think there is amazing synergy between what the council is trying to do and what collaborative housing tries to achieve for the intention of living together as a group, and that kind of democratic approach to housing is really something that a lot of councils are really inspired by, and those kind of personal links are something that that's what the council is trying to do through some of its programs. So even though it seems like a very challenging task, I think it's there. I think you're pushing at an open door with some of this stuff. If some of those systems could be set up, or people could see pilot projects that work well, then it's something that it's not a totally impossible challenge, because the ethos is so wonderful, and it can be so inspiring and helpful for the people who are there. And I think it can help with a myriad of other issues. It's not just about housing people. It's about kind of helping them settle in this country and have a network, and probably all sorts of mental and physical, benefits that are very hard to quantify, but also have financial impact on the council as well. And so I think, hopefully, there's hope for this sort of initiative.